Danger was his world. John Smith. Well now, Captain Newport, what are we going to do with that prisoner on the ship? The young man spoke in a well-bred voice, but he looked rough. His long black beard was scraggly, and his clothes were rumpled and stained. Newport looked rough and weather-worn too. The two men were standing on the bank of a lonely river, and they could see landward was a swampy, dark forest where they thought Indians might be hiding. Nervously, they turned their backs on the woods and looked at the three small boats anchored offshore. On these boats they had come from England, a miserable journey of 10 long weeks. This was an April day in the year 1607. The place was Virginia, on the unexplored continent of North America. That prisoner, Newport repeated. Smith is safe enough, chained to that beam in the hold, and that's where he's going to stay till I get him back to England. Good, said the young man. He's a nuisance, always wanting things for that rabble on board the ship, always siding with those worthless, wretched men against gentlemen like us. Like himself, for that matter. Newport waved away this talk and said, We've better things to do. He pointed down to a box that lay between them on the ground, a heavy box made of oak and bound around with iron bands. Those are the sealed orders they have gave me in England. Now we have to read them. He broke the seals and took out a roll of parchment all covered with a curly dark writing. These are the laws to govern this colony for his Majesty, King James, he said, and here are the names of the local council to rule. He broke off short, and his sunburnt face grew dark. Listen to this, he shouted. That prisoner, that Captain John Smith, he's named here to join you and three others who are to rule this colony. No, the young man tried to grab the sheet of parchment. Yes, I tell you, Newport insisted. You've got to obey these orders. In a hoarse voice, the captain shouted to the crew on the ships, Release the prisoner. Smith, send him on shore. From the boats came faint cheers as the chains were knocked off. John Smith was popular. Chaining a prisoner in those days wasn't just cruel. There was no place on board to shut up a prisoner. Between decks was the hold, and it was the only one big open space with a rough chimney in the corner where the men cooked their meals when the weather wasn't too bad. There were a few rough sheds on deck for the officers. Captain John Smith leapt ashore, leading the other passengers. These men, ragged, windburn, tired, and sick from spoiled food, were glad to follow Captain Smith and to do what he suggested. Most men liked to obey him because they trusted him. These men coming off the boats were a mixed lot. Some were gentlemen who had had bad luck, some were despairing workmen out of jobs, some were criminals exiled for their crimes. But a man could be exiled in those days for for things no one would consider a crime today. Nearly all of them were brave. They had to think of going to America at all. It was a desperate adventure in those days, as the trip to the moon would seem today. But Captain John Smith was more than brave. He was a man who hated to be safe. Danger was a kind of game to him. He had all sorts of adventures as a soldier, a pirate, and a slave to the Turks. Yet when he landed that day in Virginia, he was still only 28 years old. No sooner were the men gathered on the river bank than a flight of arrows came at them from the woods. They had loaded their guns on board ship, and now each swiftly fired off his gun toward the forest. They couldn't see anything but trees, so the shots went wild. No one on either side was hurt. While they were reloading, John Smith laid down his gun and walked forward with his empty hands spread wide to show he had no weapon. It was a friendly gesture, as though to say welcome. Out of the woods stepped an Indian chief, also holding his arms wide. The English colonist looked on open-mouthed, too surprised at the courage of John Smith and of the Indian chief to finish loading the guns. Then in dumb show the chief made them understand that he was being wary because some time ago another boat had come in here and someone kidnapped two Indians. Smith shook his head and pointed to himself questioningly. Plainly, with the motions, he was saying, "Look at me. Do I look like the man who did that?" The Indian chieftain shook his head too, and he and his band of Indians came out from under the trees. But this time, instead of arrows, they brought berries and popcorn and tobacco for their new friends. For a while, the colonists had a hard time. Most of the men were lazy. Some were sick, some were foolish. All of them were disappointed. They had come to America expecting to find gold and jewels. They would stroll about with their eyes on the ground, hoping to see shine of gold. They would save stones that glittered, but they all turned out to be a kind of iron, neither gold. Some wandered off into the forest and looked about. Maybe they thought, like a child in a fairy tale, that rubies and diamonds grew on trees. Sometimes a man wandered off alone, and an unfriendly Indian caught him and killed him. They got sick from drinking unclean river water, and they wouldn't bother to dig a well. They wouldn't even gather firewood for the winter ahead. They were too lazy to plant crops. There were plenty of wild turkeys and other game, and the river was full of fish, but they wouldn't hunt or fish. They said they weren't used to that sort of work, and many of them had malaria from the mosquitoes. They didn't know what made them sick. It was hundreds of years before doctors found out that malaria came from the bite of a certain kind of mosquito. At last, Captain John Smith got tired of all this shally, and foolishness. He said to his men, "You work or you don't eat." They looked at him in astonishment, but he merely repeated, "No work, no food." He made them dig a well. He made them hunt and kill wolves. He sent them into the woods to gather the fruit that grew there, wild grapes and cherries and crab apples and persimmons. They found little watermelons too. Most of these they had never seen before. They also gathered oysters and crabs from the beach. They caught sand dabs and other fish. From the Indians they learned how to plant corn and how to make popcorn. Popcorn was not a playtime food for them. There was no ice, and corn had to be dried or popped to keep it for the winter. From the Indians they learned how to smoke tobacco. Tobacco was so new that when the Englishman Sir Walter Raleigh smoked his first pipeful, his servant thought he was on fire and threw a bucket of water over him. The settlers enjoyed the tobacco, but they could not know that as the years went by, tobacco was going to make Virginia rich. But even in early Jamestown, it counted for a lot. The colonists used tobacco like money. A man paid so many pounds of tobacco for a shirt, so much for a pair of moccasins. One man paid 378 pounds of tobacco for a suit of clothes. When the Indians felt friendly, they brought things to eat, but they often didn't have enough to eat themselves, and they weren't always friendly. One Captain John Smith went off to make some kind of deal with them. Years later he wrote a book, and in it he said that the Indians took him prisoner. Their chief, Powhatan, he wrote, had him tied to a post and was going to kill him. But the chief's daughter, a little girl, threw herself on him and begged her father to save him. That little girl was named Pocahontas, and she became a famous girl in our history. She used to come often to visit the colony and was a favourite with the men. When she was older, she was married a colonist named John Rolfe. They had a son and went to England to live. Pocahontas was popular in England, where they called her Lady Rebecca. King James liked her very much and thought she was a great princess. As first the king said to John Rolfe, "You are not a noble. You had no right to marry a king's daughter, like the Lady Rebecca." King James didn't know much about Indians, and he thought an Indian chief like the father of Pocahontas would be as powerful as the King of England. They had to tell him that an Indian chief was just a simple wild man heading a small tribe. He was not a powerful ruler like King James himself. Some people today are not sure how much of the story of Pocahontas saving John Smith is true, but we know that she was a fine woman, and we know that Captain John Smith went to see Powhatan and took him a present of a grindstone. The Indians thought it was a wonderful gift, the best way to sharpen their tomahawks that they had ever seen. Slowly the colony found its way and grew. One day, 2 years later, Captain Smith was rowing a boat when a barrel of gunpowder exploded. He was badly burned, and there was no doctor in Jamestown good enough to heal him, so he went back to England to be cured. He never came back to Virginia, but he made 2 voyages to the coast of Maine, hoping to found another colony there. But he had no luck. After that, he had a busy life fighting pirates and other enemies of England. The men he left in Jamestown had hard times ahead. They were hungry and sick, and some were lost at sea. Powhatan became an enemy. John Smith knew how to make friends of the Indians. The other colonists often did not know how. Captain Smith had given the colony a good start, so it pulled through, and it was the beginning of the great state of Virginia. Without Captain John Smith, we might today belong to Spain. Spain was founding colonies all the way from Florida to South America. England had tried several times to plant a colony in America and had always failed. Captain John Smith made Jamestown the first successful English colony in America. Later, he showed the Dutch just how settled in New York his success in Jamestown gave courage to the Pilgrims who went to Massachusetts 13 years after he landed in Jamestown, Virginia. From Virginia came many of our most famous men: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry, Woodrow Wilson, and it was also Captain John Smith, by his strength, his common sense, and his last stand courage, who turned the little group of tired men into a solid colony.